Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to World Have Your Say. Now, I'm guessing that this time last week you'd not heard of Samantha Brick, but I bet that's changed now. Millions of people around the world have read her article in the Daily Mail where she says that good-looking women have problems with their relationships with other women in the workplace and in their personal life. We'll discuss if that's true. There's also been a huge reaction to that attack at a university in California. A lot of you outside of the States are arguing there's a connection between America's gun laws and these kind of attacks, and we'll put that theory to the test. Let me introduce you to our first two guests. Melissa is a blogger, also a gun owner, and she joins us live from Houston in Texas. Hi, Melissa. Thanks for your time.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And in New York, we have Ashley Hammond, who's English, but works at Manhattan College in New York as a football coach. Ashley, you're very welcome too.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me.
Well, both of you, let me read you this message from Christy in the US, who got in touch on our Facebook page. Christy writes, when the Constitution was written, we didn't have automatic weapons, gangs and school shootings. I am adamantly for gun control. Innocent lives are taken every day. We are a violent society that needs regulations. Now, Melissa, a lot of our viewers and listeners here at the BBC are making a connection between American gun laws and what happened in Oakland. Do you make that connection?
No, I don't make that connection because there are strict gun laws in some cities in the United States, and there are free gun laws, and there's no relation whatsoever between the gun laws and crime. And in fact, in cities like Washington, D.C. and Chicago, crime rates are higher, and they have very strict gun laws. So I don't think there's a connection at all.
Ashley?
However, Melissa, unfortunately, you can travel the United States from state to state without any boundaries, and therefore the impact of a gun law in one state positively or negatively impacts every single state in the United States. So it's very hard to say that there's no connection, because what goes on in Washington, D.C. may have originated in Arizona, it may have originated in Nevada, for example. So it's very hard to say there's no connection whatsoever.
Well, I would disagree with that, because in Chicago, for example, the people who are armed are the criminals. And so so it's true that guns can cross state borders, of course, but is that true that the guns, when they're made illegal, are only in the hands of the good people then? As Chicago is a good example of that. And so because we have so many guns in America now, the notion of getting rid of them, like Britain has tried to do and Australia's had to do, is impossible. And in fact, with Heller, that just decided in 2008, our gun rights have been confirmed, and they're not going away. So the question is, are law-abiding citizens going to be able to defend themselves?
I think we understand that good people tend to do good things and bad people oftentimes do bad things. But unfortunately, criminals will find ways to get hold of guns. And so the idea, again, that one state has a different law is going to impact the way guns are distributed around the country. I think that most people who who want tighter gun control accept the fact that guns are going to be in the United States of America. I think we accept that. I accept that. I don't necessarily like it, but I accept it. I grew up in a country where weapons and arms were much fewer and not so talked about. But the issue is actually fundamentally rooted, in my opinion, and I think in many people's opinion, in what goes in Washington, D.C. I don't think anybody wants there to be no guns, and I just don't think that's possible. What we want, and what I think most of the public want to know, is that the politicians whose blood-stained hands at the moment don't listen to the people, listen to the gun lobbyists, will tighten up restrictions, will tighten up laws, will tighten up issues in Washington to ensure that across the United States of America, we don't have this weaponry traveling the country and being used in places like Chicago, because bad people will do bad things.
Well, then how do you explain a nation like Mexico, where private gun ownership is basically illegal, and yet 20,000 people are killed a month because of the gun trade? And drug trade. And so when you have that kind of a situation, you're basically making the common average citizen a sitting duck for a criminal. And there's no putting this cat back in the bag. What laws would you prescribe to make the kind of situation that you would like? I mean, I'm curious. I'd really want to know how that would look.
I've had the good fortune to travel to Mexico recently, and there are, you know, I think it's very unfair to categorize an entire nation such as Mexico as a gun-toting or a dangerous place. I've had wonderful experiences in Mexico, and I agree there's certainly issues that Mexico faces. But again, you brought in another element of our society that's extremely damaging and extremely painful to all of us, which is the drug trade. And so therefore you throw on top of a gun cocktail, the cocktail of drugs, money, and criminal activity, and you're going to have a disaster in a, I don't want to say lawless country, but certainly in areas there is lawlessness, and certainly in areas of Mexico there are fewer restrictions than others. And I think that on top of what happens in the United States and, you know, the ability of guns to travel between the countries, it's a disaster. And the tighter we have our restrictions here will impact Mexico. And for those that don't think that we're integrally linked with some of the stuff that goes on in Mexico, we are. We are absolutely linked. And therefore, southern states like the Arizonas, like the Nevadas, those places need to be tighter. I was in Las Vegas 2 weekends. Yes, Ron.
No, sorry. I just want to jump in there and remind people that as they're watching you, and probably as engrossed as I am, but they can join in the conversation that's going on between New York and Texas. So if you'd like to join Ashley and Melissa discussing whether America's gun laws contribute to the kind of atrocities which we saw, like the one we saw in Oakland earlier this week, you're welcome to call us up. We're live here on the BBC. It's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. You can tweet us using the WHYS hashtag. We're also on Facebook as well. Let's pull up this message from Zach in Minnesota. He says, "Justify to me how the irresponsibility of one man should adversely affect my liberty. Stop punishing all for the acts of the few. At the end of the day, I must be able to defend myself, and I cannot rely on the government to protect me." Ashley, what would you say in response to that?
Well, I think we can rely on the government to protect us if, again, as I stated earlier, the politicians in Washington stop taking the money from the gun lobbyists and they listen to what I think the vast majority of Americans want, which are tighter gun controls. I don't think anybody's saying we shouldn't have guns. I think we accept, and I think everybody accepts, that good people make good decisions, that for the most part, people are responsible with their weaponry. Hunting is an enormous part of American culture, and I don't think anybody wants that removed, and gun use in general is an enormous part of American society. However, when I was in Vegas 2 weekends ago with one of my football teams, you know, there was a gun shop across the road from the Monte Carlo Hotel as we stepped out, and 1 block later, there was a gun range. And every city we go to, I take my little football teams all over the country. We're in Houston, we're in San Diego, we're in Florida. Everywhere we go, there are gun shops, and they're so painfully easily accessible and so easily on the sign, come in with a picture ID and get a gun today. That's just not acceptable for the vast majority of Americans, but their voices unfortunately are not heard because money changes hands in Washington.
And that is one of the issues, isn't it? Whether it's too easy to get a gun in America. If you're watching in the States, I should say that over the past 2 or 3 days, the majority of comment coming into the BBC from outside of America has made a connection between the gun laws and the kind of event that we saw in California this week. Do you think there's a connection? You're very welcome to get involved. The number to call from the States is 01144 2070 83 72 72. Now, Ashley and Melissa, let's bring in another guest to speak with you. Michael is an American Egyptian based in Houston, which is where Melissa is as well. He's a student. Michael, you're very welcome to our conversation. Do you think that it's too easy to get a gun in America?
It's somewhat easy, but it's not that easy. For instance, if you're a criminal, I don't think you can get a gun at all. But what I believe is I'm a gun owner, and I love my guns, and I believe having a gun is in a way to defend myself and my family if anything happens. I'm very responsible. I've had guns for a long time now, and but if for instance, the shootings that happens in school and so on, good people with CHLs, a concealed handgun license, are not permitted to have their guns at universities, for instance. So what happens is a person would bring in a gun illegally and start shooting at students, and they're not able to defend themselves. And by the time police get there, it's probably a little bit too late for a couple lives.
So this is fascinating. You're suggesting that the kind of attacks we saw earlier this week wouldn't happen if there were more guns on campus. Melissa, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. He's absolutely right. I mean, the problem where we're seeing mass killings like this are where people are undefended. And a college campus, neither the security on campus nor the police officers off campus who have to get on campus can get there soon enough to stop the carnage. And if teachers were armed, if fellow students at a college level were armed, this kind of thing would be less likely. It would stop sooner at the very least. And I'd just like to address one thing that Ashley said. He never answered the question that I asked. How would it look, these stricter gun laws? When we did have stricter gun laws, it did not decrease crime like he suggests. And so I would just wonder, who are you penalizing? Always, you're penalizing the law-abiding, and
well, Melissa, you asked what it would look.
Melissa,
you asked what it would look like. Let's give Ashley a chance to explain a little more about how he would restrict gun ownership.
Thank you. Melissa, I think it's very important to understand that at any point in our history where there's been gun control, it has always been available for interpretation by the states, and therefore there is not a blanket gun control of the United States of America. And until such time as you have federally approved and state by state approved laws that are similar, if not to within, closeness to be the same, you're not going to have the ability to say that tighter gun controls are either positive or negative. And with regards to the comment about college campuses, as a person that I work at Manhattan College, I work on a daily basis up there, the idea of having students and faculty walking around with weaponry in the event that a madman came onto the campus and started shooting is abhorrent. I cannot believe that that people in this country would believe that the idea of defending yourself is best served by people carrying their weapons around.
Michael, go ahead.
The idea that people should...
Actually, give Michael a chance to respond.
Certainly.
I was saying, just because a person has a concealed handgun permit or has a gun, some people cannot draw their gun and shoot someone. They just don't have the guts for it. And some people can't live with that. And so not everyone that has a gun or a CHL, a concealed handgun license, would be able to shoot someone, but someone would have the guts to do so if a situation
Michael, let me interrupt you and ask you, just in a one-word answer, do you have the guts to do it?
If I was never in that situation, so I don't know yet.
Melissa, would you?
I have to say the same thing. I don't know what I would do. I have to question somebody like Ashley, though. If he was standing there and protecting someone he loved, I would have to believe that I would defend my children. For example, if somebody was coming into my house. I know someone who this happened to, a woman who was alone in her home with her kids, and her house was being cased by bad guys. And when her husband left, they came in and broke into the house, and she defended herself. And so, and I can't imagine that Ashley, who loves his students and loves his football players, would want to be in a position of not being able to defend those whom he loves.
Well, I'll tell you what, Melissa, I'll give Ashley a chance.
Classroom situation.
I'll give Ashley a chance to respond to that in a couple of minutes because we're coming up to a break. So, Ashley, have a think about that. And in fact, all of you watching, do you think that when it comes to it, if someone was coming into your house, posing a threat to you and your family and your belongings, would you wish to have a gun, and would you be prepared to use it? You're welcome to call us, text us. You can get us on Facebook and Twitter. I'll come back in a couple of minutes' time. 83 72 72. Let's go across to Nuala, who's with the World Have Your Say team, to find out where we've been hearing from.
Well, lots of countries are getting in touch. We're after hearing from the US and also Jamaica. Ricardo in Jamaica tweeted us with this take. These shootings have less to do with the law and more to do with the unstable mindset of some Americans. Kane is writing on our Facebook page. He wrote, "I'm so sick of this argument. For every one person that does something stupid with a gun, there are a million that don't." But Bert in the Netherlands called us to say this. "For Europeans, the American view of guns is quite strange. Why can't the American government protect their own people rather than rely on guns?" So that's definitely one point that your guests might like to pick up on. You can keep posting, facebook.com/worldhaveYourSay.
Nuala, thank you. The number to call is country code 44 2070 83 72 72. We call you back, by the way. You won't have to pay for very much of the call. Just in case you're just joining us, we're talking about America's gun laws and whether they contribute to the kind of attacks that we saw at a university in California this week, where 7 people were killed, allegedly by a single gunman. Melissa is a blogger in Texas. She's also a gun owner. Michael's a student in Texas. Both of them are live with us from Houston. And then we have Ashley, a teacher, with us from Manhattan College. He's in the BBC's New York Bureau. And Ashley, just a couple of minutes ago, Melissa was wanting to ask you, imagine yourself, and I know this is not a nice scenario, but imagine yourself in your home with your family and someone comes in to your home. Wouldn't you rather have a gun and be in a position to protect yourself and your relatives?
I think we're dealing with two separate questions with regards to gun control and whether I personally would react to protect my family. And I think naturally I have 5 children, 2 of whom, Shay and Gage, live at home with me still, and my beautiful wife. And I would, of course, protect them. I would, of course, do anything within my means to protect them if someone came in the home. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to choose to have a gun to do that initially, because I trust the fact that our society and where I live and the people I'm around, that's typically not the way typically not what happens where I live. It's typically not what goes on where I am. And so I think we're dealing with we're dealing with an emotive issue. And yes, I would react emotionally if someone came into my home. Yes, I would be as violent as necessary to protect my family. But that doesn't really deal with the issue of gun control. And it doesn't really deal with the issue of why people are breaking into my house in the first place. And I think we have to go back to the fundamental issue, which is that it is too easy to get hold of guns. There are too many different laws potted across the country. And there is too much money that changes hands in Washington, where gun owners and gun toters are able to buy the votes of politicians, and we, the people, based on the Constitution that is thrown out in this argument all the time, are not able to express our opinions on having tighter gun control.
No, I appreciate it. I must make this clear that each state has different laws, so it's easier to get guns in one state than it might be in another. But Melissa, let me quickly bring you in before we, I can see calls coming in from Ghana, Libya and Sweden, and also there's a message from Nigeria I want to read. But Melissa, just quickly, if I lived in your street and I wanted to get a gun, what would I have to do?
Well, in Texas, you would have to have your ID, and then you would have to go into the store and buy one. But one thing I would like to say to Ashley is that
listen, 1 minute, let's understand this. All I would need would be my passport and some money, and I could go along to Walmart or any other shop and just get myself a gun.
Well, in Texas, in every state, the law is different.
Doesn't that strike you?
I mean, and they do a quick check.
What kind of quick check? I'd like to know. I mean, you don't give much information away with your passport. Surely it would be necessary to do a few more checks on me.
Well, I mean, if you're a law-abiding American citizen, buying a gun is your right. And so you don't have to prove much else besides that you're a good citizen and in good standing, and a license is enough to do it. Now, to get a concealed handgun, that's a whole different thing.
Sure. And there are 2 things which you've described, which I'm very curious to hear everyone watching around the world react to. One is you've described being able to go in a shop just with your ID and get a gun, and you approve of that. The other thing you said a few minutes ago, which was very striking, is that you believe teachers and students on university campuses should be armed, and that would make them safer. Those of you watching outside of the States, are those 2 situations attractive to you? Do you wish you could do that in your country? Do call us up. I'd be curious to hear from you. Country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Let's pull up this message from Alfred in Lagos. He's posted at facebook.com/world have your say. Guns don't make society safer, he says. They make them worse. Next time you leave home with a weapon, you'll feel like an overlord because of the strength of the death you bear. Such attitudes will never make you human. Well, Michael in Texas, talk to me about this. You've got a gun. How does it feel when you've got it? Do you feel more powerful when you go out?
No, not at all. Actually, I do have a gun, and I do have a concealed handgun license. And if I do carry a gun, I feel like it's a big burden on me and a big responsibility on me. And I try to be as discreet about having a gun and not making anyone around me uncomfortable. And I mean, for me, it's a big responsibility and a burden to be carrying a gun. I don't feel invincible at all, or like a warlord or anything at all, actually. But rather, I feel there's a lot of weight on my shoulder when I do.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I can also see calls coming in from the US, the UK and Lebanon. But actually, we're going to switch now to Australia and speak to Michael Mirasol, who's a Filipino film critic who lives in Melbourne. Michael, I know you've been following the story from Oakland closely. What are your comments for Melissa and Ashley, our other guests?
Well, basically, from an Asian perspective, I'd like to point out that the attitudes towards guns are completely different with that of the West. According to earlier statements, there have been comments about what is it like in Mexico to have guns, what is it like in the US to have guns. Every every country has its own culture with regards to relating to guns. I myself in the Philippines have been able to go to a gun range with my friends, fire an M16, a 12 gauge shotgun, and a 45 pistol. But at the end of the day, if you asked me if I wanted to own such weapons, it would be unthinkable. I mean, for most Asians, the very idea, if a school shooting happened, the first thing we would be really talking about is how can we limit this? Regardless of what laws you put in, it will always come down to the culture of the nation with regards to those weapons. I find it shocking that not only in Oakland, but like the killing of Trayvon Martin, what people were talking about right after the shooting was hoodies and not the guns. This is something most Asians and from my part of the world, we really find strange.
And Michael,
how can the politicians
let's
not
just
want
remind
to do
people,
anything?
most people won't need reminding, but the case of Trayvon Martin is a teenage black boy who was shot dead. He was 17 years old by a neighborhood watch volunteer in Florida. And of course, it's turned into a huge discussion about race relations, attitudes towards young men, attitudes towards young black men, and also the use of force against those who are deemed to be a threat or possibly suspicious. We talked about it on last week's World Have Your Say. But Michael, let me switch back to an idea you mentioned at the beginning of your comment. And Melissa, you could respond to this. Michael says he likes using guns, but he goes to a gun club to do that. Wouldn't that be a more appropriate way of managing guns in society?
Well, I'm saying, what's the point? I mean, in order to, when you go to a gun club to use a gun, you're practicing. You can use them for sport, and many Americans do, or for hunting, and many Americans do. But one reason to learn how to use your gun well is to defend your family, and that's really what we're talking about. One thing that Ashley said that's very important is that criminals will be criminals, and they'll use what they can find. In Britain, for example, there's a big problem with knife violence. So why doesn't Britain outlaw knives? And it's the same rationale. And criminals will use what they can. And so in my position is be able to defend yourself.
Melissa, I think we found common ground, because I think we found common ground there, Melissa, because I think a lot of Brits would also agree with you that knife violence is a particular issue in Great Britain that should be dealt with more severely, and I think it would be. But I'd just like to address the issue of the gentleman in Australia, because I think he makes an extremely good point, which is the cultural difference of a nation. And where most countries are relatively small and there may be a national culture, the United States has cultures spread far and wide and many and often. Last night at practice, I talked to my little Tigers and my Panthera girls teams and my boys team about the fact that I was going to talk about gun violence, and it was so alien to them that I would talk about guns, and so out of the character of their culture based in and around the North New Jersey area that it was bizarre. But if I were to talk to a kid in Ohio or Oklahoma or Las Vegas in Nevada or southern United States, it would be very much a part of their culture, and therein lies the issue. We have to knit together many cultures to come up with a law and an act that is good for all of us, not just some of us.
But I suppose the point, Ashley, is whether there is an appetite among Americans to create a new culture. Many Americans getting in touch with World Have Your say they like the gun culture just as it is. There's lots more we could talk about. I'm afraid we're coming up to the end of this segment of the programme. Ashley, Melissa and Michael, thank you very much indeed for your contributions. Let's quickly pull up this message from Elizabeth in San Diego, who listens to World Have Your Say on KPBS Public Radio. She says, I like the idea of allowing people to own guns as long as they take a gun safety class. Just like most people can drive a car with proper licensing and education, so people should be allowed to own a gun with proper education. Thanks for all of your contributions, more than I've had time to read out. Do go to facebook.com/World Have Your Say to carry on the conversation. I'm Ros Atkins. This is World Have Your Say, live from the BBC in London. Well, for the next half an hour, we're going to talk about whether particularly attractive women have difficulties in their relationships with other women because of their looks. Not my suggestion, I hasten to add, but if you're one of the millions who read that article in the Daily Mail this week, you'll know what I'm talking about. And we've already been discussing if America's gun laws contribute to the frequency of attacks like the one we saw in California this week. If you want to carry on talking about that, you're best off heading to our Facebook page. Now, if you're near your computer or have got a smartphone to hand, or a tablet computer for that matter, you're very welcome to Skype us whenever you see World Have Your Say on BBC World News. Our address is BBC_WHYS. And just in case you didn't see this article by Samantha Brick, two things really came out of it very much. One is that a good-looking woman will have problems in her relationships with other women. And another area that's really been passionately discussed is whether it is harder for a woman to have a female boss at work than a male one. Let's talk about this with our first set of guests. Dr. Sunny Career is a psychologist. Olivia Rose is a writer. She wrote on the Huffington Post this week an article titled "The Sisterhood Doesn't Want You, Samantha." And Dr. Helen Wright is headmistress at St Mary's Carn in Wiltshire in England. All of you, you're very welcome. Sunny, let's lead off with you. Thanks for coming on. Do you think she's right that if you're good looking, you're going to have problems in your relationships with other women?
I think you have to work harder to overcompensate. If you're above average in any trait, whether it's intelligence or looks, sometimes you have to work harder to make people feel comfortable. And she's obviously done the opposite. So her article, I don't think, did her any favours.
Why not?
Well, because she made herself seem immodest, and no one likes someone who's immodest. And the fact that she's not an absolute 10 out of 10 stunner, I think that led to a lot of hate towards her, because people thought she was being really, you know, quite cocky about how she looks. And I think if you are good looking, you know, you're trying to be sort of charming about it. Like George Clooney, he's a very good looking man, but no one hears him say, "Oh, I'm so good looking." He's very charming. He makes people feel at ease. He works on building rapport, and I think that's something that Samantha really should work on.
I'm glad you used the phrase 10 out of 10 stunner rather than me. Olivia, let's have you come in here.
I mean, I sort of disagree. Already we've started talking about Samantha's appearance, which is not something that I think any of us should really be discussing. I know that that's what she put out in her article, but for me, the most offensive thing about what she wrote was this kind of allegation against all women universally, that we are jealous of other attractive women. And I think that is the point, and that is where all of the backlash has come from.
I think jealousy is a natural part of human nature, though. I'm not just talking about looks, but if anyone has a lot of money, for example, if they've got a nice car, human beings, you know, we're programmed to get jealous with each other. So I think that's kind of a moot point. I mean, people do get jealous. It's just about what the behaviour you put in place to make sure that other people don't get too jealous of you. How nice a person are you? How likeable are you? If you're charming and likeable, people won't want to be jealous of you because they like you.
Exactly, and that's that. I mean, I agree with you entirely. I think that jealousy is, you know, it's a human trait, and that is something that we all do. But like even you have just said, it's not something that is just based on appearance, and that is what Samantha Brick sort of time and time seemed to be saying, is that people were only jealous of her because of her appearance. And specifically, she mentioned that this was a female issue, which I think is entirely untrue. You know, it happens among men as well, jealousy, and even in the form of appearance.
Helen, let's bring you in.
I think that all women can have issues with their relationships with other women and indeed with men because of appearance, and indeed with themselves, because we live in a society which is dominated by appearance and superficiality. And to me, that's the most important issue in this, that we should be seeking to make sure that our young people, we educate our young people particularly to think way beyond that. What is beauty? What is attractiveness? Those, I would say, are far, far more than superficial appearance. They're about values. They're about who you are, and that's what really we should be focusing on. And if this article's drawn attention to that, that's great.
You see, this is exactly why Samantha Brick's article was so difficult and so, you know, such a bad representation of women, I think, because that is exactly what she focused on, purely aesthetics. There's nothing in either of her articles, you know, that says that women were jealous of all of her achievements. You know, it just kept coming back to this idea of beauty, and I completely agree.
That's a sad but true indictment of our society. If you think about the wag culture that we've got, the huge focus on plastic surgery, how we look, even the dolls that we use, I think there's such a focus on how we look that the idealistic scenario that you talk about when we focus on values, I absolutely agree that was what we should do, but that isn't the reality of the world that we live in.
I think Samantha was trying to say something more, though, and at the end of her article she does say that she wants people to value her for who she is and not just according to her looks. Now, she's taken a particular perspective on that, but I think there's a truth in there, and if we look beyond the the content of her article, which seems to be focused solely on superficiality, then I think that if we come to that point, that's the most important point to take out of it. She herself, in subsequent interviews, has said that obviously in an article like that, you're condensing the experiences of 41 years into 1,000 words, and she acknowledges that, and she's done that partly to create a bit of a storm, and has succeeded. But the point that she's making about valuing people for who they are is perhaps the most important thing we should take.
But all three of you, you're talking generally about our attitudes towards appearance, but let me read you the headline of the article. There are downsides to looking this pretty. Why women hate me for being beautiful. And her point is that women react more negatively towards her than men do. She specifically pinpoints women, doesn't she, Olivia?
Well, I completely agree with that. And I think, you know, she's facing the same kind of backlash now that I would face if I had written an article that said perhaps men only hire women that they find attractive. You know, that is the issue that I have taken with this, is that she has pinpointed women, and not just that, British women, and said that we are the ones that, you know, will not allow somebody to progress in their career, or, for example, have them as a bridesmaid at our wedding, just because they are deemed more attractive than we are.
But I think Samantha has an issue where she maybe treats men and women differently. So if you treat a man with more charm and more engagement and perhaps even flirtation, then obviously you're going to have a better relationship. Whereas if you treat a woman that you're meeting, and if on some level you're seeing her as a competitor, you're also going to get that fed back to you. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we don't actually know how she acts with different people. And, you know, unconsciously, women do behave differently around men. There are studies that show when a man walks into a room full of women, the women in that room actually adjust their posture, they stand differently, they walk differently, and it's all unconscious. They're not aware of how they change their behaviour in front of men.
I think we should be challenging why that's the case. That's really the important element in this. Why do people act differently? Why is there such a big focus on women and their women's appearance, this notion of beauty? That's what we need to address. Now, young children don't deal with one another like that. What is it that happens to them in society? What are we doing to them as a society that makes them operate in these artificial ways? I think we really have to question our motives.
I don't think we're doing it to society. It's a universal finding that post-puberty, boys and girls act differently around each other. I think that's just biology. It's because, you know, at some point we're aiming to impress each other and get together and procreate.
But Sonny, the point is you're saying it's different. What Samantha Brick is saying, it's not just different, it's worse, that women are nastier to her than men. You're saying there's a difference. I appreciate lots of people might agree with that, but that's not quite the same as what Samantha Brick's saying.
No, I'm saying that Samantha treats men and women differently and therefore gets different treatment in return. But I'm also saying that she probably doesn't realise that she's more charming or more flirtatious with men. It's an unconscious thing. She gets more from them, so she piles it on more, and it just cycles that way.
All right, all three of you, hold your fire for just one moment, because if you're watching and want to take part in this discussion between Sunny, Helen and Olivia, you're very welcome to tweet us using the WHY hashtag. We're live as well. You can just call up and speak to them if you'd like to. It's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. If you didn't jot that down, I know it's not the catchiest of numbers. You'll see it up on the screen very soon. Now, let's pull up this message on the Daily Mail website where the article was posted from Charlotte. If she thinks she's good looking, then good on her. I'm 16 and most girls my age hate the way they look. It's much more positive to look at the good things, which is exactly what Samantha is doing, but you're condemning her for it. Olivia?
See, I kind of disagree that she's looking at the good things. I think that what she wrote was actually very negative. And I think that some of the things, you know, and I'm sure I will receive backlash for saying this, but, you know, she alludes to flirting with men and, you know, and kind of progressing through her career by using her looks to her advantage, which I don't necessarily disagree with. And that, I suppose, would be the positive thing to take out of, you know, her beauty, if you want to call it that. But then the focus of her articles is actually this kind of negative stance on the sisterhood, which is what she calls it, whereby she says that you know, unlike men, we are jealous of other women because they are more attractive, or if they are more attractive than us.
Helen, you work with children. Do you think there's a self-esteem issue with girls and their appearance?
Most definitely. most definitely. I spoke out a lot last year about the sexualization of our society and the pressure that that places on young girls. And it's around them all the time. They're surrounded by these images of unattainable, notional beauty. And we have to work really hard in schools to make sure that we're looking at enabling the girls to believe in themselves for who they are, regardless of how they appear. And it's that self-confidence which comes out, which is of most value to them ultimately. But
Okay,
it's a hard job.
We've talked about being good looking and how that affects relationships between one woman and another. After the break, we're going to talk about whether it's harder for a woman to work for a female boss. So those of you watching, if you want to take part in that particular discussion, now's a good time to get in touch. Hi, I'm Moz Atkins. Thanks for joining me here on World Have Your Say. We're getting a reaction to that article in the Daily Mail, which has been tweeted thousands of times, read by millions of people. It's written by a woman called Samantha Brick, and one of the things that she talks about is that she finds it harder working for a female boss than a male one. Let's talk about that with our three guests. Olivia is a writer, Sunny's a psychologist, and Helen is a headmistress. So Helen, I should really start with you. Do the women teachers at your school have a harder time working for you than they would do working for a headmaster?
Well, I sincerely hope not. Actually, I think that there are often so many negative anecdotes or negative surveys, but for all of those, there are positive anecdotes about working for and with women. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever why women don't make good leaders, good bosses. That's what we're expecting our girls, particularly in girls' schools, to do. We're training them to grow into themselves and lead authentically, and there's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't happen. Of course, women have had less opportunity to do that in the past, but that's a feature of our social history, and that's changing and has changed.
Sunny?
Hi, I think that's an interesting point about leaders versus bosses. I think women do make great leaders. I think sometimes they don't make great bosses. And in my experience, there are two reasons for that. I think firstly, men are more transactional. They want you to get the job done. They're not that bothered about the social side of things. Whereas when you work with women, because we are more socially oriented, sometimes bosses and employees become friends, then the boundaries blur, and that can get tricky. The second issue I have is that sometimes women in high positions, they're often perfectionists, overachievers, they work very hard, they find it harder to delegate, and to be honest, they have to be, because women have to work harder to get to the same position that a man would, and therefore it can be exhausting working for a woman who's always having you sort of prove yourself, or maybe is being a micromanager. So I think those are my two main points. Men.
All right, well, there's a couple of things I'm sure Olivia will want to respond to.
Well, I mean, I would say I'm a freelancer, so I've worked in lots of different offices under lots of different female bosses with different management styles. And again, you know, I don't think that you can blanket say that female bosses are harder to work for than male bosses, because male bosses come with their own set of difficulties for a woman in the workplace. And actually, I think that it's very damaging for Samantha Brick to write an article like she has done, which says that female bosses are harder to work with and will not allow you to be promoted for your looks or other reasons, because actually she's sort of bringing women back and saying that women are these frivolous people who care, you know, not about the hard work of their colleagues, but only whether or not they are more or less attractive than them.
No, I agree with you. I think Samantha's article does do a disservice, and I agree that working for a male boss and working for a female boss really depends on the situation and the occasion, and there are benefits to working for a woman. I think in my experience, working for male bosses is easier because it's just so much clearer about getting the job done, going home, and there's no extra added pressure or extra added boundary blurring, which I think makes things difficult.
I can almost hear, as you're talking, Sunny, women all around the world reaching for their phones and their keyboards to tap out their responses. If you are feeling moved by what Sunny and Olivia and Helen are saying, World Have Your Say is on Facebook and also on Twitter. Now let's bring in a guest who contacted us when we talked about this subject on our radio edition yesterday. Mandalee's an architect from Jamaica but living in Trinidad at the moment. Mandalee, you're very welcome on the programme again. Give us your perspective on working for men or working for women.
Well, I think it's highly circumstantial. I mean, as an architect in the creative field, it can be beneficial sometimes to work with women, you know, especially when we're on site, where a woman can be sometimes objectified. I mean, it brings in all the issues of sexism in this particular part of the world and in my field. So I think it's circumstantial and it cannot be generalized, and it does tend to kind of put an acute focus on the negative aspects of working with genders, and I think that issue is, is somewhat moot from my point of view.
Mandy, thank you very much. And Sunny, isn't that exactly what you're doing? You're dealing in generalizations, stereotypes, and things that really haven't got much to do with individual cases.
Speaking as a psychologist, generalizing and stereotyping, it has a root in real, real stories and real behavior. And the reason we do that as human beings is because our brains have to categorize. We just simply can't process all the information thrown at us on a daily basis. So stereotypes, categorizations, generalizations actually help us get through the world that we live in.
But then, I mean, if that is true, then why did Samantha Brick not write in her article, some female bosses may, or there are some women in the world who would feel jealous?
Nothing I'm saying is to defend Samantha Brick. I'm just saying from my perspective, this is my experience. I think Samantha in her article made loads of mistakes, and her blanket generalization of all women being jealous of her was a major one.
Thank you very much, Olivia and Sunny. Let's put up this message from Kelly in Texas, who's got in touch through facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. To me, it's not about her physical appearance, but the attitude she presents. Narcissism can be a quite ugly thing. This is a great way to set women's rights back 50 years or so. And Sunny, just in 30 seconds, do you ever worry that some of the views you're espousing might put back the cause of women?
No, I don't think so. I think women make great leaders. I think they've made huge strides in the workplace. They'll continue to do so. But there are some things we can improve. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Sunny, who's a psychologist based in London. Olivia's a writer in London, and Helen's a headmistress based in the south of England. Thanks also to Mandy, a Jamaican architect in Trinidad and Tobago. To all of you who got in touch and we didn't get you on the air, I apologise. You can carry on the conversation online at facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. Also, if you'd like to get involved in our radio edition, it's on air in 1 hour's time, and wherever you are in the world, you can stream it at bbcworldservice.com. So that's World Have You Say on the radio in 1 hour's time, bbcworldservice.com. I'll be back a little after that with World Have You Say Extra. Thanks for your company. I'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.